Hello, my name's Tess Ryan, and I've decided to make this video as I was a survivor from domestic violence, bullying and stalking from my narcissist husband. This was many years ago now. In those days, domestic violence wasn't really considered a crime back then. The police, if you called them, they wanted to leave you alone. They didn't really twig on about domestic violence until people started coming up murdered and badly abused and injured with their injuries, and then all of a sudden they realised that domestic violence was a real problem. I was on the fringe of that time. It was at a time when if you wanted to take out an AVO, you had to go to the federal police to do so. Their hours were between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, Monday to Friday. Therefore, if you were abused, you had to wait till Monday morning if you were abused after 5 o'clock on a Friday night or during the weekend to report the crime that had happened to you. This happened to me several times. It was back in 1977. I married my narcissist husband. I must say, a narcissist knows how to pick his victim, and I was quite an easy target. I came from a very religious family church. We were given strict principles in the Christian teachings. There wasn't a lot of love in my home. My mother had a very hard time displaying any affection, and my father was working a lot. I had 2 brothers and a sister. When I started at school, I was bullied all my primary school years. Therefore, not having much love at home and being bullied, by the time I got to technical school, my self-esteem was at a 0 level. I had no self-esteem. I hated myself. I hated the world. All I ever wanted was approval and somebody to love me. So by the time I got to technical school, I'd had enough of being controlled in a Christian discipline home and at school disciplined. So I threw in my job and I moved out with a girlfriend, got a job. We both moved into a flat together. Needless to say, I was a very easy target. I did have a boyfriend at that time. I went a little bit wild and ended up getting pregnant. He left me after 5 months. So therefore I was a single mum. Well, things didn't work out well in the flat and I moved back home to my parents' house. I stayed there during my confinement time until I had the child. I stayed there for a couple of years, but then decided no, I needed to get out on my own, start afresh. So I had saved a little bit of money at the time and I moved out into my own unit. Once I moved into my own unit, I didn't know what was ahead. I had an anticipation of something great happening. I had no idea what was going to happen. But as it turned out, I was a very easy target. Being a person who had no self-esteem, all I wanted was a companion, somebody to love me, somebody to care for me. And so, therefore, the very first man who came along happened to be a narcissist, and he picked me well. He picked all my weaknesses, what made me tick. And my very first mistake I made was I got married too soon. Within about 8 weeks of me knowing this fellow, we were married. He swore his heart to me, promised that he would look after me. and so we were married. And the first red flag actually happened the week before we got married. He'd had a few drinks and he just went ballistic one night and grabbed me around the throat. But because all I ever wanted was to be loved, I just overlooked that. I just wasn't willing to accept that there was anything bad wrong with him. I had that happily ever after scene before me. So I went ahead with the marriage and I got married, and the very night, the wedding night, he went ballistic again. He'd had a few drinks. He was a person who should not drink. And he grabbed me around the throat, and once again I just would not accept that he'd done anything wrong and forgave him. He came to me crying, and the very next day he bought me gifts, bought me flowers with tears, told me he loved me, and this would be the pattern that would continue. He would get drunk and he would just go ballistic and hurt me. Sometimes it was pushing me into furniture. He always pushed me into furniture, never touched my face because he knew that would be able to be seen, but he would rip chunks of my hair out. He'd spit in my face. He would call me numerous names. And it's funny, many people have said since then, why didn't you go? Why didn't you move out? The thing was, it's a very easy thing to say, why didn't you move out, if you're not emotionally involved with that person and you don't have a fear of that person. It would be quite easy to separate yourself from the situation. But when you have invested time into a relationship, all you can see is the positive. You just want it to work. And in my mind at the time, I felt that he needed me just as much as I needed him. Well, as it turned out, I was wrong. That was another mistake I made. If ever you're told a sad story, don't let sympathy be a foundation for your relationship. Sympathy is no foundation for your relationship. In actual fact, we aren't martyrs. We can't change another person. I felt that if I was with him long enough and I gave him enough love, I would be able to change his behaviour. And that was wrong. It was wrong completely. I had no right to change his behaviour. I had no right to change him. But don't ever think that you can change another person, because it's wrong to do so. Anyway, as time went by, I became pregnant with our first child. And he tended to get a little bit better when I got pregnant with our son. He actually went out and got himself a job. He hadn't worked up until that time. Also, after that time, I found out that he had charges on him, and I realised later on that the reason he wanted to be married was to make it look better for him in court. It would get him off the hook, having a wife and children, that the judge would go easy on him. And at that stage, he did have a list of priors that I didn't know about. And I wouldn't know about them because we got married too fast. I didn't get to know him. That was another lesson that I had to learn. Don't ever get married or make a commitment to a person unless you've known them at least 12 months. You need a period of time to get to know a person, to get to know their flaws and all their good points. Anyway, as time went by, I had the child. I got sent into hospital. I had a good birth. And that very night, he went out to wet the baby's head. He went out and got himself drunk. Well, at about midnight that night, I heard screaming. I heard names being called. He was at the nurses trying to get to me. They had to call security and he was thrown out of the hospital. After that time, I brought my son home, and things tended to deteriorate with a narcissist. Things are all about them, and he didn't like not having the attention solely on him. I was very tired because I had to get up for the baby, and my other son was 3-year-old at the time. I threw myself into the housework. I was a spotlessly clean house at my housework, and with him out at work, he had a high expectation of what his house was going to look like, and also having his meal on the table when he got home. And he did actually have a pair of white gloves. We have heard that little charade where people go over things with white gloves. He actually did have the white gloves, and he would go over it, and I would be in big trouble if the place wasn't clean. In fact, I washed the floors night and day. I did all the dusting, everything. But I noticed after a while, my 3-year-old son was following me everywhere. He would not let me go to the toilet on my own, the shower on my own. He would be screaming at the door if I left him out of the toilet, or whilst I was having a shower, I could not work out what was going on. However, my husband had started to deteriorate, and with me being tired and having to get up at night to the child, and I was spending extra time cleaning the house, I was really tired, and he was demanding sex. And if I said I was too tired, he would take it physically, and he would be rough. He would rape me. That was just another form of control on his part. Also, the house cleaning wasn't good enough for him, and anything I did was not good enough for him. If he came home and there was a pair of shoes with their shoelaces still tied up, or a cupboard door open, a drawer door open, we've all seen the film of Fatal Attraction. The towels weren't matching up, I would cop it. I would get a torrent of abuse. I would be spat on, I would have my hair pulled, I would be thrown around, and that's the way it was. So I got to a point where I was just too scared and just tried to be compliant and do everything the way he wanted it. And I told myself at the time, perhaps it was my fault. I wasn't a good enough wife, I wasn't a good enough mother, I wasn't good enough for anything, and I also hated myself. At this particular time, I decided to try and get the baby weight off because he'd started calling me fat and ugly. He also told me that nobody else would want me, that it would be impossible for me to get anybody else because I was too fat and ugly and stupid. This is the way of a narcissist. They get you to the point where you feel you're just worthless without them, that you can't go on without them, and they're the only ones that are there for you. And this is the way he had me. He also started knocking me around more, but I noticed my 3-year-old son was getting very upset